My name is Cynthia Koch, and I'm the president of the Clinton Historical Society. But I've also, in the past, was the director of the FDR Library in Hyde Park, and I'm currently affiliated with an FDR Foundation at Harvard. So I'm still really interested in and doing a lot of work with regard to Franklin Roosevelt and Eleanor Roosevelt. And this particular talk, I think, should have some relevance in the new presidential administration, since they're, obviously President Biden has been so interested in modeling many of his programs after the New Deal and is so conscious of the effect of the first 100 days. I am trying to define cultural legacy very broadly, almost in the sense of anthropologists who talk about culture as all of the things that we carry about in our minds, their ideas, their manners, their modes of thinking. And in my mind, it also includes things that are part of the material world. So it's a very broad definition, and I hope you'll bear with me as we start on our adventure. Let me see. Okay. No. Yeah, there we go. We're going to start by talking about the fact that in March 4th, 1933, Franklin Roosevelt was inaugurated at the depth of the Great Depression. The Depression had been going on for 3.5 years at that point, and the presidential approach under the Hoover administration had been what we would today call a top-down approach. He was convinced, and his advisors were convinced, that the best way to address the financial crisis was to strengthen business, strengthen the financial industry, strengthen international trade. When Roosevelt became president and during his campaign, he emphasized exactly the opposite point of view, which was a person-to-person kind of approach, an ability to truly, to truly communicate with people. And one of the most famous ways that he did that was through the fireside chats. These were radio addresses that were given about 32 times during the 12 years of his presidency. And they were revolutionary in the fact that for the first time, he was using the radio to speak to people. He always started, "My friends," and he adopted a conversational approach that let people believe he was actually right there in their living rooms, listening or speaking to them through the radio. And it was a very effective approach. And as I said, a very different approach from what people had been used to. This third year of the Great Depression, fourth year of the Great Depression, was the depths of, really the depths of it to that point. When FDR took office, the official unemployment rate was 25% nationwide, but it had fallen, it had risen to a point of as much as 78% in industrial areas like Youngstown, Ohio. People had to depend on the local charities and local government for relief, whether it was food or housing, any kind of support for the homeless and the hungry, and it was running out. We also know that a new crisis struck the country just in the month before Roosevelt's inauguration, which was a banking crisis. And by the morning of inauguration, 3/4 of the nation's banks were closed. And that very morning, the Chicago Board of Trade and the New York stock market shut down. The country couldn't have been in worse shape. Oh, as we look back at this, notice that the men who are standing in this line are very well dressed. They look to me like office workers. They're not much different in appearance from the people who are walking by. And I think that gives us a sense of the breadth of this depression. Here's another view of men who look much more like they have been enduring difficult times for a long time. And they're at a soup kitchen in Washington, D.C. And I think that their faces and their patience represent something of the endurance that people have put up with and are continuing to suffer through. I also had a question once from someone who was watching this program, and he asked me, why is it that it's always men in the soup lines? And I didn't really know the answer, but now I've learned that women during the Depression, very different from today, they were really very much homebound. And the idea of going out in public and standing in a line was perhaps dangerous. It was certainly not something that they wanted to expose themselves to. And it was particularly difficult for unemployed single women. There were some programs for families, but unemployed single women suffered perhaps more than anybody other than African Americans in the South. But they were deeply, deeply stressed and reduced really not to going to soup kitchens, but to scrounging around in garbage pails and behind the markets and behind the restaurants to see what they could find to eat. Hoovervilles are one of the emblematic visions of the Great Depression. It was, sardonically called Hoovervilles because these are people obviously who were pushed out of their apartments and out of their homes, inability to pay rent, inability to keep their mortgages. And these shanty towns sprang up in cities all over the country. And I want to point out in the middle of that photograph that you'll see some children, pointing out again that this was a disaster that was widespread and affected women, families, unemployed men. It was tragic in every way. Then on top of the economic crisis, the 1930s was a time of environmental crisis. The 30s was a drought struck beginning in 1933, and off and on throughout the decade, there were waves of drought, and those droughts were accompanied by these huge dust storms. And they were basically the inheritance of decades of poor land use. In the periods when prices were high, certainly during World War II and the years leading, or World War I and the years leading up to that, farmers were encouraged to put more and more acreage under cultivation. On the Great Plains, thanks to improved technology, they were able to cut through the thick cover of the native grasslands and plow it up to plant corn and wheat. And when drought struck, you had storms like this one. Probably the worst one was in 1934, when the dust storms bore all the way to the East Coast and even out to sea. People in Washington and New York, and a ship 300 miles out at sea had this dust, the soil of canvas in their hands. Tragic. The 1930s was also a period when the nation's infrastructure had not kept up with the industrial development of the 1920s. The 1920s is the decade when modern America arrived, probably most completely with the availability of the automobile. But it's also the time when homes are being electrified. You were having new sanitation systems. You were having the radio coming into prominence. Modern America had arrived, but most of the investment in the 1920s, which was a low tax era, most of the investment had been plowed back into the industrial plants and into development, fueling the constant boom times. When the Depression struck, the nation was literally in the midst of the horse and buggy era. The whole country needed work. And so one of the first things that the Roosevelt administration did was begin to put people to work. It was called work relief. Now, there was an emergency program to simply get money to people that was administered through the states, and it was called the Emergency Relief Act. but it wasn't getting there fast enough. So by the fall of 1933, looking toward what was predicted to be a very, very cold winter, the administration did what had never been done before, which is make direct payments to individuals from the federal government, and they put people to work through the Civil Works Administration, CWA. So you see them working here on a road in San Francisco. The whole idea of work relief was to protect the dignity. It was the psychology of giving workers a paycheck, something in exchange for the money that let them have the self-respect that they needed and that they deserved. And that was really the brainchild of Harry Hopkins and FDR, who together, in the face of a lot of criticism, because it was actually cheaper to simply hand out the dole, as they called it, than it was to devise work programs. But both Harry, for his feelings about the people, he was a social worker by profession, and Franklin, for his feelings for the people, but also his determination to build a better nation. Maybe like build back better today. Together, they were determined to devise kinds of work programs, and ultimately, Harry Hopkins became the head of the Works Progress Administration, which replaced the CWA and began operating in 1935. From the beginning, this WPA employed most of its workers in construction, and that's what it's really known for today. You can see some men working here. And here, without the benefit of power tools, WPA workers building a connecting road in Tennessee. Here's a similar road produced with similar tools that enabled school buses to get through a formerly impassable road. WPA projects went back to the model of the federal government distributing money to state and local governments. And it was through these state and local agencies that the funds were made available. So localities, people in a locality would make an application and it was very quickly approved. But basically you would find that different communities were using their monies in different ways where they thought the need was greatest. So here you see a rather major construction having been built in Charleston, West Virginia. And then an even more major one in New York City, where LaGuardia Field is part of the WPA construction projects. There was yet another, even more major public works program during the New Deal. That was called the PWA, and it was under the administration, under Harold Ickes was the administrator, through the Department of the Interior. And they built the really huge things like the dams and the major bridges and a lot of the construction that, like the WPA, continues to be the foundation of much of the nation's infrastructure today. Some of the projects are very charming and have continued to serve their communities and also as a basis for tourism, such as the San Antonio Riverwalk. Others addressed, horrible needs within the communities, like this swampy area right near the center of Southington, Connecticut, which was drained and the water contained into a free-flowing canal. Schools were a major target of WPA construction. This was a school for African-American children in Georgia. And what it looked like in 1935, it was replaced, and in 1936, a brand new schoolhouse must have made such a difference in those students' lives. It was also a time when a lot of projects that had been, frankly, ignored, some of them problems created by environmental problems created by reckless industry. In this case, and in some cases throughout Pennsylvania, it was not unusual for coal fires to be smoldering underground for decades. And you see here the WPA engaging in firefighting efforts to try to put these put these fires out at long last. The WPA was also thrown into disaster and relief effort for natural disasters. Here you find men signing up to work during the Ohio River flood, which was a massive flood in January 1937. It displaced tens of thousands, but it also gave an opportunity to reach out to people that were not so easily reached by government relief efforts. You see these children in a school run by the WPA, set up also to house them. It also was an opportunity to reach children who otherwise were not being regularly seen by doctors and nurses. So here we have a medical team marshaled to do inoculations in Memphis during the flood of 1937. Eleanor Roosevelt was an important force behind the New Deal in almost every way, and particularly the WPA and some of its associated programs. Her interests were always among those who were the most needy. Here she is with an African-American nursery school in Des Moines. She was very interested in civil rights, in workers' rights, and in education. And as we shall see, the arts. I'm showing here one of my favorite paintings, and it's a painting entitled, "We Can Ill Afford to Lose the Energy and Skill of These Young Men and Women." And it is a painting that was done actually as kind of a poster to promote the New Deal in Kansas for the 1936 fair, when Roosevelt was running against the governor of Kansas. But what it does is it tells the story of this National Youth Administration, which was created by executive order out of the WPA. And it focused on providing work and education for young people. It included a division of Negro Affairs headed by Mary McLeod Bethune, who worked at the agency from 1936 to 1943, and is generally seen as sort of the head of the FDR's Black Cabinet. By 1938, college youth were being paid between $300 and $400 a month for work-study programs that helped them stay in school. And another 155,000 boys and girls from relief families were paid for part-time work that included job training. A lot of them were high school students who had to drop out to help support their families. So this got them educated and got them, earning a useful wage. The NYA was headed by Aubrey Williams, a prominent liberal from Alabama, who was close to both Harry Hopkins and Eleanor Roosevelt. And that brings us to probably the most famous relief program of the New Deal, which was the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps. It was a personal favorite of FDR's, started during the first 100 days in 1933. And it really played to his great interest in forests, in conservation. In fact, he used to call himself a tree farmer on his income tax returns. And on his estate in Hyde Park, planted some 400,000 trees during the course of his life there. But this was a relief program specifically designed for young men between the ages of 18 and 25, although it was later expanded. And each young man received $30 a month, but he was required to send 25 of the dollars home to his family. Known as Roosevelt's Tree Army, it employed about 3 million men before it was disbanded just before World War I. A lot of historians have given the CCC and the training program that it provided a lot of credit for making the fighting force of young men ready for the demands of World War II. There was also a women's component, much, much smaller, but another little project of Eleanor Roosevelt's which was derisively called, I think derisively, the she camp. And it was a camp for, again, unemployed single women. And unemployed single women, again, had, problems of being suspect. They weren't family women. There was a great deal of prejudice against women working at all, taking men's jobs. So it was a struggle to get this program going. Of course, they were always questioned for their moral rectitude. But anyway, they managed during 4 years to set up 90 camps, which educated women, gave them training skills, and they also did conservation work at some of the camps. And it helped to give a leg up to about 85 young women. By 1937, this is the famous quote from his second inaugural: "I see 1/3 of a nation ill-housed, ill-clad, ill-nourished." And the second administration is really the period when, well, a lot of the early programs of relief begin to become established programs. And we see a lot more of reform efforts in this period. And we also see the WPA doing things that we might not remember, such as providing school lunches prepared and served by the WPA. It was also famous for paying people to do their jobs. And in this case, many, many women were employed in sewing rooms in almost every city and small town. This one was in Louisville, Kentucky. And it, as you can see, is a segregated sewing room. Many of the programs of the WPA were segregated at the insistence of Southern senators, Democratic senators, who were responsible for getting the legislation passed. But and much as the federal offices in Washington tried to make sure that the wages were even across board, the effect of the local administration was to actually find some kind of double-tiered wage structure. Nonetheless, the employment that African Americans received through the WPA was crucial and very much needed during this period of terrible economic crisis. The products of the WPA sewing rooms were then distributed to the people on relief through outlets such as this. One of the things I like about the whole New Deal really is the way in which it captures sort of the diversity, not only of the people, but of the traditions of our country. And so this is a group of women who were making traditional mattresses using Spanish moss. They were paid to do that, thus extending the life of that tradition, giving them a hand up of money for what was desperately needed. So, you find people being paid for what they do, and no real questions were asked. And it added to the genius and diversity of the WPA. Bookmobiles were an important innovation during this period. And you see here a bookmobile project sponsored by Virginia. And it's taking books to the soldiers at Fort Belvoir. But sometimes it wasn't so easy to just drive to an army base. And you have one of the more quirky examples of the genius of the New Deal in the packhorse librarians of the WPA, who took books and magazines by mule and horseback, if necessary, to isolated rural people. And then a much more middle class sort of way, you have some communities choosing to have a paid school patrol to control traffic. This is one of, I think, the most affecting pictures I've seen of the New Deal. I wish it were more more well known, but this is a group of children in Georgia staring longingly and in some case unbelievingly at these toys that they're going to get to play with. So there were lending libraries sort of for toys that were repaired and made by WPA workers. If you were a shoemaker and shoes needed to be repaired, the WPA would set you up in a school where kids would bring in the family shoes and they would get taken care of. This one was in Asbury Park. But it wasn't all blue collar. A lot of times we forget that this was also the WPA reached not only the arts programs, which we're going to talk about later, but also things like the sciences. Here we have an entomologist working at the Natural History Museum in San Diego. And WPA professional supplemented staffs at museums and other public institutions. So they weren't just put to work by local government. They were also a vital support system for cultural and nonprofit organizations as well. Here is one of many archaeological projects that employed WPA labor as well as WPA archaeologists. And then, of course, there's the story of the great national forests. FDR, as his love of trees and his love of conservation, was a great sponsor of programs to really create public access to the national parks. One of the greatest of these was the Timberline Lodge, opened on Mount Hood in Oregon. Roosevelt came out and personally dedicated the lodge, which was entirely built with WPA labor. WPA workers also produced the textiles, the furniture, even the murals on the walls of the lodge. It also is a representation of one of the more basic impulses that found voice during the New Deal, which is access for everybody to recreation, to the arts, as we will see. It wasn't that these kinds of activities that had previously been available only to those with money. There was the great idea that the government had an opportunity to make everybody fully participants in the life of the country. So here's a ski slope built at Timberline Lodge, but many of the ski slopes at many of the ski areas that we use today were WPA projects. Public golf courses. Almost every city would have a public golf course designed by professionals, built by the WPA. And swimming pools. Again, this idea of, spreading access to recreation to everybody. As the 30s were winding into the war years, the WPA also became involved in doing defense-related work, such as this worker who is working in a lab that's dedicated to finding an alternative to the natural rubber sources that were, of course, being threatened by the expansion of the Japanese into Southeast Asia. WPA workers also began to work in defense plants on the construction of war material. And then WPA workers were also engaged in part of the massive public relations campaign that was geared up as part of the war effort to build morale and keep people working together and rationing and doing whatever has to be done to win the war. So that was probably the biggest way in which Americans were exposed to the work of artists employed by the WPA. And I think it's very telling when you look at this particular quote, but also the circumstances in which it is given. And this is sort of my introduction to the art programs of the New Deal. Here he is giving a radio address at the dedication of the Museum of Modern Art, which of course one would expect one to talk about modern art, perhaps talk about the importance of the whole art world to American society. But instead, he talks about the WPA artist and says, in rendering his own impression of things, speaks also for the spirit of his fellow countrymen everywhere. I think the WPA artist exemplifies with great force the essential place which the arts have in a democratic society such as ours. Now, there were actually 4 New Deal's arts programs. One of the other things about the New Deal is that it was a time of great experimentation. As Roosevelt famously said during the campaign, what this country needs is action and action now. I propose to try something. If it doesn't work, try something else. And so there were these 4, 3 of them much smaller than the 4th, the WPA Federal Art Project. But the first one, well, Treasury was a part of the Treasury Department, and it was administered by Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau. I'm going to back up. So the Public Works of Art project was parallel to the Civil Works Administration, and it ran during that period of intense need from the fall of 33 to the spring of 34. And there was the section on painting and sculpture and the Treasury Relief Act. All 3 of those were parts of the Treasury Department. And then the WPA was a separate entity. So here we have famous Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau, Jr. And the first Public Works of Art project, as I said, was a crash relief program. And that whole, that first winter, they spent a lot of money very fast just to get it out to people. And this was the time in which people questioned paying artists. And that's when Harry Hopkins famously said, well, they've got to eat too, don't they? So during that winter of 33, 34, they employed 3,700 artists and spent $1.3 million. I mean, phenomenal sum. Actually, the whole CWA was so expensive, Roosevelt, who was still trying to balance the budget, shut it down, too much criticism. George Biddle, a friend of Franklin Roosevelt's, is given a great deal of credit for advocating for paying artists. Biddle was, like Roosevelt, educated at Groton School and Harvard. He prepared to be a lawyer, but then changed his mind and became an artist, traveled and was educated in Paris and Munich, and ultimately by 1928 was traveling around Mexico with the famous Mexican muralist Diego Rivera. And in his correspondence to Roosevelt, he recommended paying artists the way they did in Mexico, which was basically, if you are building a new building, you need a plumber, you pay him. You need an artist, you pay him at the same rate. Now, others, of course, were advocating. It wasn't just something that sprang whole cloth from George Biddle's mind, but it's important to give him credit for his role in inspiring this and in encouraging it. Here's something he did for Franklin Roosevelt. I can only imagine that it has something to do with the Democratic donkey, but I don't know. Maybe someone out there, I know Chip Holman, who is an arts gallery owner, can tell me something about this later. But so this was given to Roosevelt and is in the Roosevelt Library collection. Here you see Mrs. Roosevelt again, and this time she is helping to promote the launching of the PWAP in 1933. Here she is with the new administrator, Edward Bruce, as well as a well-known art critic, Forbes Watson, and the director of the Brooklyn Museum, Lawrence Roberts. So through this effort, that's where these 3,700 artists were employed in about a 6-month period. Examples of some of that work made its way to the FDR library. This is one of my favorites. And here's another. The second Treasury program project started in the fall of 34 and lasted throughout to 1943. And it was the complement to the major federal building programs. And it commissioned art and sculpture, or painting and sculpture, for new federal buildings. And this was part of the Public Works Administration. And it ended up commissioning through 1,400 contracts. And it was much more carefully administered, spent about $2.5 million over its 8 years. Typical of the work of these artists are things like this mural in the Federal Post Office building, Federal Triangle. Harry Hopkins, concerned always for the people on relief, managed to get some money out of the WPA into Treasury to finance some federal buildings with artists who were on relief. And it employed about, as you can see, 446 persons, and it was a much smaller program, but it was important for the impact in smaller, more local federal buildings. It was headed by Olin Dowse, a Hudson Valley friend and neighbor of FDR, and he administered the Treasury Relief Arts Program. He had also been the East Coast director of that first program, the Public Works of Art program. And some of the famous local projects that were produced under that were actually painted by Olin Dowse himself. This is a mural in the Rhinebeck Post Office. There were murals done in the Hyde Park and also the Poughkeepsie post offices. This one has recently become the subject of controversy because of the depiction of what appeared to be African-American enslaved workers. But I'm glad to say that it looks like this will remain in place thanks to some conversations sponsored in our local historical community by the head of the Dutchess County Historical Society, who is helping to educate many people about the fact that, yes, slavery did exist in the Hudson Valley, and it's important that we understand that. Another view of the Rhinebeck murals. Like so many of the murals that were done during the New Deal, they were historical subjects with a patriotic theme. So this is telling the story of Rhinebeck, from the first Native Americans, and not incidentally ending with the Roosevelts. And in the distance behind the Native Americans, you see the Henry Hudson's half moon coming up the river, which would of course change everything for the local tribes. And now we come to the Federal Art Project. It was called Federal Project Number 1 and included not only fine arts, but also drama, music, and writing. And it started with the rest of the WPA in 1935 and was administered, as were all of the WPA programs, based on need. People who were on relief were eligible to receive this work. And it lasted until about 1934. As you can see, about 5,000 persons were employed at its peak and cost about $35 million. Harry Hopkins was the administrator of this program, as he was the administrator of the whole WPA. And he first employed artists when he was the administrator of a temporary emergency relief agency when Roosevelt was governor. So you can see that the history of employing artists does not actually begin with the New Deal, but almost. Here's Harry Hopkins watching a potter at work, engaging children, And it's another one of these constant ways that the New Deal and the WPA, all of these agencies were constantly informing the public about their work and essentially advocating for them. Here he is with the woman in the black hat, Hallie Flanagan, and one of her teams of actors and actresses, and they're having a grand time. And Hallie Flanagan was the head of the theater project. She actually taught theater at Vassar College here in Poughkeepsie. And notice here that it is a fully integrated cast. This would get Hallie and the theater project in trouble. But another thing that got them in trouble was a series of plays that they did that were addressing contemporary issues. They were known as the living newspapers. This particular play was critical of the agriculture department for its policy of plowing under crops in order to raise prices for farmers. But other even more controversial plays included Ethiopia, which was critical of Italy's invasion of Ethiopia, and it was censored. It was never allowed to be performed. Injunction lampooned big business. And Power was more palatable. It was a story of the TVA, but again, very controversial, 1/3 of a Nation, which dealt with substandard tenant housing. The program was shut down in 1938 by the first House Un-American Activities Committee, which was headed by Martin Dies. But not everything that the theater project did was controversial, nor was it politically inspired. So here you see the traveling circus. And so it's a shame that it got tangled up in the politics of the day. Another big part of the WPA arts programs was the Federal Writers Project, which produced well-known, I think today, landmark guides to every state and to the major cities. And they really are more than, for a long time I thought they were basically tour books, but if you read them, you will find, first of all, that you've got very talented writers. And what they're doing is they're digging into the local history and the cultural background of these many different parts of America. Again, this essentially patriotic impulse to celebrate the nation. Another aspect, and I apologize for this photo, but it was very, very tiny. I wanted to talk about this program, which was the Slave Narrative Program, part of the Federal Writers Project. And writers were dispatched out to the country to talk to former slaves. Of course, they are very elderly at this point in the 1930s. And this man, William Colburn, age 93, was one of the 2,300 who gave his oral history and allowed himself to be photographed for this Federal Writers Project program. We are fortunate that those narratives remain in the Library of Congress, are an essential resource for historians and anthropologists and others to this day. Another part of the Writers Program was this folklore project, where writers were sent out to document the stories of different racial and ethnic communities. And this one is particularly interesting because Ralph Ellison met literally a man who called himself an invisible man in Florence, South Carolina. And of course, Ellison's famous book was The Invisible Man. Other well-known writers who worked for the Federal Writers Project were Saul Bellow, John Cheever, and Zora Neale Hurston, to name just a few. Makes you wonder if these people would have been able to continue their careers if it hadn't been for this vital support. And here are some of the characters behind the various aspects of the programs. We talked about the National Youth Administration, and Aubrey Williams, the administrator of that, is shown on the one side of the screen holding the newspaper. In the center is Ellen Woodward, who administered a special program for professional women So not all women were relegated to the sewing rooms. Many others were involved in projects that gave them training and skills that they could put to use. And then on the far side is director of the music program, Nikolai Sokolov, who had been the director of the Cleveland Orchestra for many years. He was a classical musician and, of course, held many sponsored classical productions in the music program, but also music of all sorts. So you can see people having a great time at this Federal Music Project dance band performance in Detroit. This man, Holger, otherwise known as Eddie Cahill, headed the Federal Arts Project. He was a curator and had been employed in the arts, and I think what's most intriguing to me is to know that he worked with John Cotton Dana at the Newark Public Library, which started perhaps the nation's first public museum program, in which trying to reach out to new audiences and bring them into the museums. And they also had a very important influence on the Newark Museum, which had its basis in sort of art for the immigrant communities. So Eddie Cahill, actually born in Iceland of all things, is also, I want to just name a few of the artists that should ring, familiar to you. Ben Shahn, Marston Hartley, Jacob Lawrence, and Jackson Pollock all were supported during the federal art projects of the 1930s. But it wasn't just employing artists to do easel work or mural work. The project also sponsored community art centers, like this one in Virginia, and classes, for instance, this children's arts class at the Walker Art Center. And of course, like all New Deal projects, it was very good at promoting itself. So here's the WPA pavilion at the 1939 World's Fair with this stupendous mural by Philip Gunston, Work the American Way. Here's one, a mural, again, talking about work, which was a common theme, telling the history of labor in this country and the role of the immigrant for an installation at Ellis Island. And another, which is just like overflowing with wonderful projects, is the lobby of the Cook County Hospital, which has the murals by Edward Boyd Johnson. Again, this is telling the story, I think, of the peopling of the whites on the American West. But you also see a mosaic mural there, as well as the figure at the center by Charles Umlauf, and even the benches were WPA projects. And then there are the collections that made their way to the FDR library in Hyde Park. The library was not yet open in the 30s. It actually was opened in 1941. But nonetheless, people from all over the country were sending things to the president, particularly from the various state WPA arts programs. So I thought I would just show you a few of them that made their way to the library. This one from California. Oftentimes these were considered prize winning or particularly beautiful pieces, or perhaps the first piece to come out of a state program was sent to the president in gratitude. There was also a folklore project within the arts program, and this one shows a Pennsylvania German design from 1789 that was put into a Folk Art of Pennsylvania portfolio. Similar portfolio for Spanish colonial design in New Mexico. Of course, the art programs documented people at work, industrial, people at play, and people enjoying literature and music. This is a study for a mural that was to be installed. I don't know that it ever made it, but it was done by it was ever installed, but done by the Illinois Art Project. And again, showing the stories of poets, Stanberg, Edgar Lee Masters, Vachel Lindsay, and a farm family. Many of the photographs and much of the information in this talk came from Nick Taylor's book, American Made, When FDR Put America to Work. So I want to make sure that I give him great credit. I also just want to go through this list that is in his book of the contributions of the WPA and suggest again what a legacy, what a cultural legacy that is. For without roads and bridges and buildings and airports and nursery schools and hot lunch programs, concerts. And I take a minute to look at the 225,000 concerts to audiences totaling 150 million. The population of the United States at this time was about 120 million. And then even in the short 4 years of the of the theater program, they managed to reach 30 million in their performances. There were 475,000 works of art and 276 full-length books. What a cultural heritage it was. But it wasn't just through the WPA that we find expressions of cultural importance. Each of the different departments, this being a poster for the Resettlement Administration in the Department of Agriculture, is a very fine piece of work by Ben Shawn. And then, of course, there are the irreplaceable photographs of the Farm Security Administration. Perhaps this is the most famous photograph of the entire New Deal, done by Dorothea Lange, called Migrant Mother. The Farm Security Administration sent a group of photographers out across the country to document rural and industrial conditions. They produced 175,000 images. And again, we are so fortunate that those images are now in the Library of Congress. And some of the important photographers besides Dorothea Lange are Walker Evans, Russell Lee, Arthur Rothstein, Ben Shawn, Jack Delano, Marion Post Wolcott, Gordon Parks, John Fashon, and Carl Meidens. I also want to take a minute just to address the National Park Service, which was transformed during the 1930s from an agency fully dedicated to the forests and natural areas, national parks, to one that also took history under its wing. And so you find the whole historic sites of the United States suddenly part of the national park system. And then one of the most lasting archives was created by out-of-work architects, draftsmen, and photographers who were sent out to document every single historic building in every single community in every single state. So we have this historic American building survey for each state. And again, that exists within the National Park Service as an archive of immense value to researchers today. And so I'm going to close with this quote from FDR, which I will read to you. There was a time when the people of this country would not have thought that the inheritance of art belonged to them. A few generations ago, the people of this country were often taught that art was something foreign to America and to themselves, something imported from another continent, something from an age which was not theirs, something they had no part in, save to go to see it in some guarded room on holidays or Sundays. Now, this was a speech made at the dedication of the National Gallery of Art. But again, he's expressing this huge idea of egalitarianism and inclusivity that we don't think about today. But that was what the whole story of the New Deal was, which was access. It seems to me to speak to the spirit of the times. It's a cultural legacy that sparked creativity because people's best They were allowed to do their best in the arts, in education, learning, access to opportunity, recreation, the environment, and infrastructure. And all of these cultural expressions continue to benefit us today. Thank you so much for listening. It's been my pleasure to give this program. Now,